If you're looking to get into medicine, then this is for you, because today we're chatting with Melvin, who got an ATAR just below 99 and 95th percentile UCAT score, and is also studying at Monash now. So welcome, Melvin. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
Sounds good. So maybe just to get started, first place is just what interested you in medicine in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess taking it back to maybe around year 10, where you sort of get to that stage where you think about what you want to be when you grow up. And I sort of looked at the interests that I had, and I'd say my three main interests were sciences, particularly health sciences, biology, an aspect of sort of lifelong learning, as well as working in teams with other people to sort of help others. And once I sort of triangulated the three of them, medicine felt like the most natural career option, and haven't looked back since.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people, the reason why they initially think potentially medicine could be them is they like science subjects at school and they think maybe medicine is relevant in that way. Did you feel like that translated over in that you were interested in science and that made medicine a good pick?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like a lot of people do kind of share that same testament where they're interested in science and that's why they sort of want to study medicine. And it's a good link between the two, especially in your sort of pre-clinical years of first year, second year. Quite a lot of it is built on, biology, for example, that you learn in school, or chemistry. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I guess obviously medicine's pretty difficult to get into. When you first decided that you wanted to get into medicine, how did you feel about your chances of getting in overall?
Yeah, I mean, look, I understood sort of the difficulty of getting into medicine, the sort of odds that were there. To give you some context, prior to my year 12, at my school, usually about 1 to 2 students every year got into medicine. And maybe around 40 to 50 applying.
Oh, wow.
But it was sort of a delicate balance between, I knew what my odds were in terms of getting into medicine and how tricky it's probably going to be. And therefore I had some backup options available. But it's also sort of balancing that with the hope that you can actually achieve this goal that you set to yourself, because if you don't have that, then there's really no motivation to get home and put the pen to the paper, really.
Yeah. How did you kind of go about that? Because I know a lot of people who are interested in preparing for medicine and the UCAT exam, on one hand, they want to get into medicine, but on the other hand, they don't want to put all this time into the UCAT exam, which isn't going to help them for any other way, really, other than getting into medicine. Yeah. How did you kind of navigate that question mark, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's two things.
Yeah.
Firstly, it's probably making sure that you start early.
Yeah.
Because if you start early, you sort of have a bit of foresight into, okay, this is what's required for me when it comes to the UCAT over the next however long. And this is what's required for me in terms of my year 12 subjects.
Yeah.
And you're not sort of having to choose between the two as much. And the second thing's probably making sure that you're consistently keeping check of yourself on how you're actually progressing.
Yeah.
Because if you're, preparing for the ATAR, for example, but your school subjects really just aren't hitting that level that's required, maybe looking at the ATAR is probably not the best use of your time, and vice versa as well. If you're not doing that well in the ATAR, not doing that well in the UCAT, maybe more attention needs to go to that.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that's one of the biggest things. When people generally join our programs, for example, or even when they're in the program, a big question is often how am I going? Am I making enough progress? Am I on track? How did you kind of go about that for both ATAR and UCAT, just knowing are you doing well enough to get the result you want, and are you on track?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think it comes down to having very consistent, quick feedback loops.
Yeah.
For example, you think of a plane.
Yeah.
A plane flies in a very clear direction.
Yeah.
But you can take the plane maybe a degree off course, 1 degree east, and will you notice a difference immediately? No.
Yeah.
Will you notice a difference maybe 10, 50, 100 meters later? Probably not. But then once that plane's been flying for 6 to 12 hours, you'll notice a very stark difference between where that plane is and where it should be.
Yeah.
And the same goes when it comes to your ATAR and the UCAT. You need sort of consistent feedback loops of how you're actually tracking. Because for some people, when it comes to the ATAR, they only start their practice exams, a month, 2 months out from the real exam. But when you sort of think about it, you're really checking how off track you are for the very first time, months and months after you've actually probably gone off track.
Yeah.
So having those feedback loops in place consistently really helps.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Because personally, that's what I found when I was preparing for my first year 12 subject I did in year 11. And I remember I didn't do any mock exams the whole year. Probably a month before the exam, I did a mock exam. I got about 50%. And I thought, oh, wait, I probably should have been revising stuff the whole year rather than doing nothing.
Exactly.
So it is definitely good to have that feedback all the way throughout the year. Maybe like if we jump into like the different elements required for medicine, obviously there's UCAT, there's ATAR, there's interview. Maybe we start off with UCAT because that's a big thing that's sort of an extra thing outside of school. How did you kind of go about preparing for the UCAT overall? Because like you got a good UCAT score. What was your approach?
I mean, to give you a bit of context, like I sat the UCAT exam in 2020, which was the second year of the UCAT being in Australia and New Zealand. And I guess by default of it being in the second year, there wasn't too much structured preparation out there and because really everyone's still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
So my main priority is really just learning as much as I could about the exam. And what I quickly realised is, sure, the exam's only been in Australia for a year, but it's been in the UK for much longer. And there are some differences between the two exams, but a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
So I used that as a bit of sort of a ledge to gather as much information I could about the exam.
Yeah.
It did have some advantages. It also did have some disadvantages. I'd say the main advantage is probably I could make the adjustments that are needed for the UCAT early on, like learning how to actually approach this exam, what's actually required of you when it comes to this exam and the techniques that are involved.
Yeah.
The disadvantage of spending this much time researching and reading is that naturally I found with my school subjects, they all declined at that point.
Yeah.
Because you only have so much time if you're at school 9 to 3 every single day. You only have so many more hours left in the day to dedicate to UCAT research, but also kind of the school subjects that you're already doing. So that was the sort of main trade-off that I saw happen, or the main disadvantage.
Yeah. And how did you kind of balance that? Like when did you first start looking into the UCAT?
Yeah, well, I started looking into the UCAT briefly in year 11 when it was first announced.
Yeah.
Because I knew eventually I needed to take that exam.
Yeah.
And then towards the end of year 11 to the start of year 12, I moved into a little bit more intensive preparation.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I quickly realized is that with that sort of time frame, I did just naturally find a lot of my school subjects sort of drop in as I was preparing for the exam.
Yeah. How did you balance that, I guess? What was the best strategy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing is probably having a plan.
Yeah.
Because really, if you don't have a plan, then you really just fall down to sort of your predetermined behaviors and systems of what you do in a particular day. So for example, with the UCAT, in advance, talking months in advance, I pretty much just scheduled what UCAT work I was going to do every single day for the next 3 to 4 months.
Yeah.
Had it down on a whiteboard. Next to that was, all the marks on my practice exams, and I could have a clear indication of what I need to do tomorrow, the day after, and 30 days from now.
Yeah.
As well as all my scores and how I'm progressing.
Yeah.
And just really sticking to that plan.
Yeah. And I'm guessing for each section of the exam, you probably had like a clear target for like you wanted to get this score, which meant you needed X marks on the exam, I'm guessing. Yeah. What scores were you aiming for on the UCAT going into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with the UCAT, with the different sections of the exam, people naturally have ones that they're quite good at and have ones that they're not the best at. For me, my best two sections were quantitative reasoning and decision making. Yeah. So I was really thinking of those as like my maximizers. Yeah. So I was looking to get, out of a 900 total score, getting above 800 in both. Yeah. And then for the other sections, just really sort of maintaining like around a 700 for them. Yeah. Which is probably a pretty good approach overall, particularly now because abstract reasoning's gone. There's just 3 sections. If there's 2 sections where you get 800 plus, you're pretty well set up. Like unless the third section you completely bomb, like you're going to get a pretty good score. Yeah. Probably the biggest one, which most people, which you didn't mention as one of your favorite ones, is like verbal reasoning. Yeah. Most people who start preparing for the UCAT that I speak to, like verbal reasoning section where they do a mock exam, they find it really hard. They find time pressure really difficult and they're not really sure of the way to improve in it. How did you go about preparing for verbal? Yeah, definitely. So the way to treat verbal reasoning, in my opinion, is to really not treat it like a reading comprehension test. Yeah. Because in a reading comprehension test, you work through the 200 to 400 words of information, look at the question and then answer it. And that would work in verbal reasoning if you had unlimited time. Yeah. But you don't. So you sort of need to recalibrate the way that you approach it. And you can really just start by making micro adjustments. So the easiest thing you can do as a good starting point is before you look at the text, just read the question and then look at the text. Yeah. Because really, if you just look at the text without looking at the question, you don't know what you're looking for. Yeah. But if you can kind of pre-frame that in your mind, you can jump into that. Yeah. And then you can sort of intertwine other things like, you know, using keywords. You can contextualize passages so you don't even have to read them anymore.
Yeah.
Really just layering on those skills one by one.
Yeah. How about in terms of like timing strategy? It's like a lot of people, like obviously to get a good score in verbal reasoning, you don't need to get 100%. You don't you don't really need to get 90% or 80%. Like it's even lower than that. Like, did you have a score in mind where you wanted to get like, I don't know, 32 marks or a certain score?
Yeah. I mean, 32, 34, that's like a pretty good sort of range.
Yeah.
In terms of time management, to answer your question, when it comes to verbal reasoning, you know, ideally you sort of hit the sort of time per question that the section allocates, but like most students and myself included, you do find yourself going over time. So what I do like to do is sort of in the last 6 minutes of the exam is just sort of check where I'm up to in terms of how many questions do I have left, how much time do I have left, is this above the average time per question, is this below the average time per question? If it's above, I can sort of take a little bit more time to process each question. But if it's below, I have these sort of last resort mechanisms. For example, the two main question types in verbal reasoning are your true, false, can't tell questions and then your standard reading comprehension questions. It's a lot easier to get a true, false, can't tell question right when there's only 3 options, then you only need to scan for the one question stem compared to 4 different options we have to scan for each question stem. So I go back to those last resort measures where I prioritize those questions and then go back to the reading comp after. Because I think when it comes to verbal reasoning, and really with the UCAT, your goal isn't to get 100%. Your goal is to get the easiest marks that you can and just get the most marks that you can.
Yeah, that's true. Because that's the key thing with the exam. Like every question's worth 1 mark. There's some questions that are going to take you double the amount of time of all the other questions. So might not secure those ones first.
Yeah, exactly.
Going back to like DM and QR, your stronger sections, how did you approach those ones and what do you think led to you getting the higher scores in those sections?
Yeah, definitely. So I think with decision making, I scored about an 810, 820 on the exam. One of the main things that really helped is realizing the different question types in decision making. So you have your syllogisms, you have sort of your logical puzzles, you know, your Venn diagrams, which you can break up into Venn diagram to text, text to diagram, and text to text questions. And once you've sort of laid everything out on a table, you can think of the strategies that are required for each of them and then practice those strategies individually. So once I kind of practice those strategies, I could head into decision making and I know that no matter what question comes up, like I know how to approach it. But it's first about making those clear distinctions. And then when it comes to quantitative reasoning, I've always been a math student actually, but what you find with quantitative reasoning is sometimes the best math students perform quite bad on quantitative reasoning. And students that are quite average in maths at school are the ones getting 800s and 900s. Because it's really not an exam that tests your mathematical ability per se, but moreover, your triaging skills. There is a massive difference when it comes to quantitative reasoning of the easiest question to the hardest question in terms of the time investments that are required. And like you mentioned before, they're all worth 1 mark. So quantitative reasoning, one of the biggest things that helped me was triaging questions, looking at a question and having the time to think, first of all, would I realistically know how to solve this question? And then if I do, how long is it going to take me? If it's going to take me too long, even though I know how to get to the answer in the back of my head, it's about sort of swallowing your pride, hitting the flag button and moving on to the next question that might take quicker and coming back to it later. Yeah,
that's true. It's definitely like very applicable across every section on the UCAT exam. Going back to your first point as well about within DM, you broke it down into different question types and then for each of those question types, you focused on a strategy as well. I feel like that's like such a powerful way to think about it overall, not just that section, but every subject. Because otherwise, what I found is a lot of people for the UCAT, they have one section which they find really difficult. Often it's verbal reasoning, but sometimes it might be DM. And it's very easy to say, like, I'm bad at DM. Like, I just keep getting low scores and I'm just bad at the whole section. But often when you drill down into it, like the students really good at like 3 of the, 10 question types. They find them super easy. They always get them right. The other 7, they just get them always wrong. And like realistically, if you chip away at one question type at a time for like a week, like any question on the UCAT exam, any question type, let's say, if you focus on it, realistically, you can get pretty good at it pretty easily.
I agree.
How did you kind of, I guess, in terms of the way you approach your UCAT preparation, was there anything that you did differently, do you think, to most students that allowed you to score better than most people, obviously?
I think the main difference I sort of had to make, and for students who are preparing for the UCAT, you'll do yourself a big favor the early you realize this, is the way that you approach the UCAT is completely different to the way that you approach your Year 12 subjects. So if you take like maths, for example, and we can plot this out on a graph whereby the horizontal axis is the amount of questions that you do and the vertical axis is your competency level.
Yeah.
In maths, generally speaking, the more questions you do, the better you'll get at maths.
Yeah.
But if you kind of swap out maths and put the UCAT in, where again, horizontal axis is the amount of UCAT questions you do and the vertical axis is how good you are at the UCAT, it doesn't look like the sort of exponential-esque graph that maths has. It's more kind of like a sinusoidal graph with a really small amplitude, and you have these peaks and you have these dips, but by the end of it, you really haven't changed too much from where you started. So it's about making that realization at the first, and once you've made that realization, you can really understand that this is not an exam that's dependent on me learning what's in a textbook. It's more over an exam that tests the way that I can approach questions and the strategies that I do apply to them.
Yeah.
The earlier you can see that, the better.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Because I feel like a lot of people, they do find that they do a lot of work for the UCAT exam and they feel like they're not really making that much progress, which probably kind of stems back to that reason overall.
Yeah.
I guess overall with the UCAT exam, is there any like general tips where you would say if you were sitting the UCAT exam again, you would definitely want to do this, or you would definitely recommend people do it?
Yeah. I'd say generally speaking, one of the main things when it comes to the UCAT exam is realize the sort of weightage of the exam. For a lot of people, it's a very foreign exam. It's something that people are only introduced to sort of in their later years of high school once they've got, 10 years of schooling down their belt, and that's the only avenue of education they've ever known. But when you look at sort of most of the universities in Australia that take undergraduate medicine, the UCAT is worth just as much as their ATAR. And I hear far too much from students who I've worked with over the past 4 or 5 years about, I don't have enough time to work on the UCAT because I have this school test coming up. When they realize that the UCAT's probably 6 to 12 times more important than that one school test that you're doing. But I think once you realize the weightage of the exam, that gives yourself permission to give the exam the time that it deserves on a daily basis.
Because I do think it's very easy when everyone else at school is focusing on not the UCAT to think like I'm going to leave that later. Like a lot of parents often at the start of year 12 or even sort of middle of year 11, they'll say like, oh, we're just kind of focusing on school subjects. Maybe like, I don't know, a month before the exam, we'll think about the UCAT. But given it's worth like just as much as all your school subjects combined, which is very, very surprising, really. It definitely makes sense to put that time into it. Why do you think the UCAT exam is worth so much? Like now you're at medicine, in medicine, can you kind of see why that would make sense?
So I guess the whole sort of rationale with the UCAT was this is an exam that tests skills that have been scientifically proven to lead to good clinical performance. Because prior to that, and I guess prior to the UMAT as well, you're really just kind of taking the top performers and then ranking them based on their school subjects. When sort of medicine and working even as a medical student is a lot more holistic than that. And it tests different sort of skills that traditional schooling doesn't really test. So that's why we have sort of the UCAT there and the interview there. Obviously it's more work, but I guess in the long run it might make better clinicians. Yeah,
that's true. Because like I remember when I was researching into it and I was thinking like, why is the UCAT exam? It's like 2 hours. Why is it worth the same amount as all the other school subjects combined? And initially I thought, does it really make sense? Like, I'm not sure. But when you think about it, like, they're trying to improve the quality of patient care into the future. They want to pick people who are not just smart, but they want to pick people who are going to become really good doctors so the quality of patient care increases. Then it makes sense not just to consider grades. It makes sense to consider the UCAT exam, which is testing for those character qualities, like you said, but then also the interview. So when you think of it in that way, it does kind of make sense why they do it that way. So I think that's kind of covers UCAT. Any other things you kind of wanted to add on UCAT prep?
That sounds good,
in terms of ATAR, so obviously that's, even though it's worth the same as the UCAT, you still need to get a really high ATAR score, and most people getting a 99 ATAR score or a 98 plus is like fairly difficult. What do you think worked best for you in your preparation? It's
a good question. I think looking back to sort of my year 11, year 12 preparation, it really came down to time management. And I think there's sort of 3 main things I considered when it came to time management. The first was using my time intentionally. We sort of hinted at that a little bit before. A lot of students, and I was like this myself, is you get home, you decide when you want to start studying, and when you do decide that you want to start studying, you then think of, okay, what should I study today? You start studying and then you stop when you want to stop. But the thing is, once you extend that over a long period of time, you're really leaving a lot of gains and opportunity on the table. So the first step is sort of using your time intentionally. Realistically, every single hour of your day, you should have some sort of idea on what you're doing. So that when you get home, instead of thinking about what should I do, you just do what you've told yourself to do beforehand.
Yeah.
So that's the first part, sort of using the time intentionally. And then I guess the second part that I sort of think about is using my time efficiently. Really, when you break down productivity is just leverage multiplied by time. How much time do you have? How much can you get done in a single unit of time? And when it comes to efficiency in studying, if you sort of think about, like, one of my favorite principles is that work expands to fill the time that you allocate to it, right? So you get home, you tell yourself, today I'm going to do a practice exam.
Yeah.
How long is that practice exam going to take? The whole day.
Yeah.
But instead, if you tell yourself, I get home, I'm going to allocate 2 hours to this practice exam because right after that, I need to do another one.
Yeah.
Magically, you've shrunk the time it takes to do that practice exam to 2 hours.
Yeah.
And you'll sort of learn, like, as you experiment a little bit more about your own efficiencies, how long does it take you to work through this amount of content? How long can you concentrate for? How long can you study before it just starts becoming diminishing returns?
Yeah.
But really sort of trying to squeeze the most out of your time. So I mean, once I've used my time intentionally, and then once I've used my time effectively, the sort of last step I think about is how do I win back some time? So if we go back to that sort of equation of productivity is leveraged by time, so you can sort of pull on both levers to increase your total productivity, right?
Yeah.
The easiest lever to pull is your time.
Yeah.
So really, what time do you finish working, right?
Yeah.
You finish studying at 6 p.m. Can you push it back to 7 p.m. and get an extra hour done?
Yeah.
And then 8. But what you will find, though, is as you keep pulling that lever, one time the lever will stop.
Yeah.
And that's when you run out of time for the day. So now you're in a different sort of situation, and you have to start looking at the sort of leverage lever and how can you make the most out of your time.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of life-changing things that worked for me in year 12 is realizing that regardless of what I want to do or not, I have to be in school from 9 to 3 every single day. Why not use that to my benefit?
Yeah.
Free periods, for example.
Yeah.
So a lot of schools, when students get to year 12, because of the scheduling, if they've accelerated a subject, they'll give them free periods.
Yeah.
What I used to do with my free periods is take that as a bit of an extended lunch.
Yeah.
Muck around, talk to my friends, have a bit of a break. But then I realized, I could get an extra exam done during this free period that I wouldn't need to do tonight. And then I can move tomorrow's work to tonight, and I'm already 2 hours ahead of schedule for the week. And then I took it a step further as well in terms of my classes. I realized that in class, because I was ahead of most of my subjects, so I kind of just used class to coast a little bit and just talk to my friends. But I could do some work in class. Yeah. And that way, once you've done that, I really just almost immediately doubled my output every single day. Yeah. And once you extend the time horizon long enough, you'll see a drastic improvement in what you can actually get done. Yeah. So I really think it just comes down to first being intentional with your time. Like, how do I want to spend these days? And then being efficient with your time. How can I squeeze the most out of these days? And then lastly, how do I win back my time? Yeah. Where are the little pockets where I can figuratively add hours to my 24-hour day?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all three of them, particularly the last one in terms of how can you win back your time. There's both like adding extra time, but also thinking of things that you're doing that actually aren't helping you very much. Because I know when I was in year 11, I was taking my first year 12 subject and I spent heaps of time just like writing out the textbook as my own version of notes. Yeah. And like at the end of the year, I realized all that time was completely wasted. It took ages of time. Like I spent hours a week doing it. It had no impact at all. Whereas, I don't know, going through past exams, finding possible questions for different topics, drafting model answers for them and learning them. So when it came up on the exam, I could just spit that out. That was like super high value, for example. Yeah. So how did you kind of go about knowing what was actually useful compared to like, the reality is like a lot of our preparation probably doesn't actually do that much. Yeah. How did you differentiate between that?
No, it's a great question. And something that I really sort of grappled with when I was in year 11, if you zoom out a little bit, studying is a universal thing. Yeah. No matter if you're 5 years old or 50 years old, no matter where you are in the world, here in Australia or on the other side of the world, the realistic thing is you have to study. Yeah. And studying is an integral kind of component of society. So it makes sense that people have probably done a little bit of research into what is a good way of studying and what's a bad way of studying. And I recommend like all students really just do a bit of research into the sort of science behind studying and the research that's been done. And what you'll quickly realize is not all studying is the same. Yeah. Like you mentioned, there's some studying techniques that aren't as effective and some that are. Yeah. And once I sort of realized that in year 11, I could sort of pivot the way that I studied. So for example, in year 11 and year 12, like I never wrote a single note for school. Because it just didn't make sense to me once I've read the scientific literature on it, on, you know, why do I need to write down my maths formulas and notes in 3 different pen colors and organize it nicely on the page when I can just open up my textbook and look at them right there and then do some more sort of higher yield techniques, things like practice questions, things like mind maps and flashcards and teaching content to other people. But I will say though, I have seen plenty of students, and probably when you were in Melbourne High, you saw a bunch of students as well who, scientifically speaking, over-indexed on these low-yield study techniques, but still performed really well. They've gotten really high ATARs and studying medicine and things like that. So I think the general advice is do a bit of research and then just try out everything and see what works for you, and then stick with that. Yeah,
I do agree. Personally, for me, that was the biggest thing that changed between year 11 and year 12. Like in year 11, I just had no idea how to effectively study. And when I figured out how to do that more effectively, that was a thing that actually made it easy for me to see how it's actually possible to get a 99 ATAR or a 99 ATAR. Because otherwise I can just, if there's nothing that feels more frustrating than you're putting in heaps of work. You're doing more work than other people in your class and they get way better grades than you, and you kind of wonder why. In terms of like basic productivity techniques, because like obviously there's a lot of different things you can do, what would be like your top couple where no matter what, even just now when you're studying at uni, for example, you would always do them?
Okay. I'd probably say the number one, when you sort of think like 80-20 principle wise, the number one habit that's probably changed productivity, so how much work gets done, is having a calendar. Like for me, every single hour of every day has been scheduled for the last few years. And having a calendar to work towards does two things. Number one, it makes sure that I actually know what I'm doing, and I can have a realistic holistic output of what I'm actually achieving in a particular day. And also just treat it like a little game when it comes to my calendar. It's like, you know, I've got this work that I've allocated myself, 2 hours for. How can I get this done in less than 2 hours so I can have a head start on the next thing? So that's a really big thing that helped me. And then in terms of efficiency wise, I'd say one thing that's very underrated among students is good sleep when it comes to productivity. Sleep, it's pretty much like a super weapon, really. Sleep, if you can sort of get to a stage where you're sleeping consistently and sleeping for an adequate duration of hours, the sort of cognitive mood and output that translates into the next day will go back into your studies and it's pretty much a flywheel that keeps on turning. So once I sort of figured that out, it really helped me, because for me, and I feel like a lot of students, a lot of us kind of fall into this temptation of, let me just extend the time that I fall asleep just to get a little bit more work done. But you realize that, again, that sort of little bit of extra work that you do get done isn't worth the negative cognitive output and mood the next day.
I agree. How do you go about having a good sleep schedule? Because personally for me, I've kind of noticed, because I've tracked my sleep on like Oura Rings and different watches and stuff, and I kind of found ultimately if I sleep at the same time every night, 99% of the time I'm going to get a good sleep, and that's really all I have to worry about. How do you kind of approach it?
I mean, it's something I've been juggling with for the last like sort of 5 to 7 years really. And I sort of tried every single little thing. Like for example, if I knew that I had a night coming up where I'll be sleep deprived, I'd preload a bunch of extra sleep and I'd backload a bunch of extra sleep on the days after. But really, I think this is really just sort of a microcosm of life. The most obvious thing was the thing I was most blind to. Go to bed at a reasonable time. So what I do now is I set a clear parameter of when I'm going to sleep. Nowadays it's about 10:30. And I tell myself, I have to be in bed by 10:30, and I don't have the luxury of pushing back that time like I used to. It does two things for you. Number one, it ensures that you get enough sleep in a particular day. But number two, now that you've set this clear parameter, you sort of force yourself to learn how to be more productive during the day, because you need to get still the same amount of work done in less time. So the sort of two-edged approach really helps. I definitely agree with that. In terms of like your most effective times, because like for me, I know that in the mornings when I first wake up, like in year 12, I woke up at 6 and I did like 2 hours of work before school, because that was when I was most fresh. Some people wouldn't like doing that, but then I know some people study from 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, or I know people at Melbourne High were studying all night long really. Whereas for me, after 6 o'clock, I'm done. That's it for me. Like, when was your best times for study? I really think it's very environment influenced.
Yeah.
When it comes to when people study the best.
Yeah.
I guess scientifically speaking, there are sort of morning people and
Yeah.
night people, and you have sort of genotypes and phenotypes based on that. But for me, back at school, I lived about 5 minutes away from school, so I'd wake up at 8 o'clock and I'd still get there on time.
Yeah.
So I never really was too much of a morning person. So most of my study did sort of occur in the afternoon and evenings.
Yeah.
But then now transitioning into university, where I have to be up at between 5 to 6 a.m. to get to the hospital on time, I've now become more of a morning person, where a lot of my best work happens in those sort of 4 to 6 hours in the morning.
Yeah. So it's good to know that you can adjust it based on your schedule. Like obviously there's maybe a time where it's slightly more optimal and preferable, but if you want to get work done in the morning, you can. If we go back to like your actual subjects you did in year 12, like the more maths-based one and then English as well, how did you tackle maths, and then maybe we'll jump into English after that?
Yeah, definitely. So with maths, it kind of goes back to what I said before about having feedback loops in place. For a lot of people, when it comes to maths, they're sort of reading through textbooks, doing it through practice questions. But one habit that really helped me is I started doing the end of year practice exams at the very start of the year. So January, I was doing practice exams onwards.
Yeah.
And sure, I'm not doing that amazing in them, but at least kind of going back to that plane analogy, at least I know if I'm headed in the right direction or not.
Yeah.
So all I do is practice exams. And then I guess sort of setting all of that up, I'd use my kind of school holidays really effectively as well. So I remember the school holidays before year 12 started, in that sort of year 11 to year 12 break, I finished a lot of my subjects.
Yeah.
So I did the textbooks for all my math subjects, chemistry, things like that. So that when I started year 12, I was doing practice exams already.
Yeah.
So that sort of really helped me do that.
Yeah.
And I guess moving into English, to give you some context, I wasn't the best English student.
Yeah.
Year 10, year 11, I was getting C's, sometimes D's as well.
Yeah.
In year 12, I was ranked 3 in the school, dropped about 2 marks in English. And I only made one change. The only change I made in English in year 12 was that every single week I wrote one essay. That's all I did.
Yeah.
Because if you sort of think about it, most people when it comes to English, they'd write maybe 3 practice essays and then they'd have all their school essays as well. So we can call it maybe 7 to 8. So if everyone's doing 7 to 8 essays and most of them are cramming at the end of the year, if you can do 47 essays throughout the year, by default, you've done so much more work than someone else. So that I was pretty confident that no matter what topic came up on the end of your exam, I had, quotes and information and everything really ready to go.
Yeah.
So that's only the really one change I made in English. And it only took maybe an hour to 2 hours a week.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's so simple, but it's something that is so, for a lot of people, it's like there's a lot of resistance to doing because writing, it's very different to like other subjects where the study might be fairly relaxing, like reading over your notes, doing some revision, doing flashcards or whatever. But writing, just sitting down, even though it's only for an hour, you can just literally put the timer on, get it done, and then move on. There's a lot of resistance around it. How did you make sure that you did it? Because like I think everyone would agree it's a good idea, but a lot of people would not do it consistently.
I think having some sort of accountability makes it really work. So the sort of 2 people I had to I guess keep me accountable is number one was my teacher, and then number one was I also had a tutor as well. I knew that no matter what happens, I will have to meet up with my tutor on Saturday morning. Whether I have an essay with me or whether I don't have an essay with me, I still have to meet him on Saturday morning. So there were plenty of times where it's Friday night, I realize I haven't done an essay this week and I have to whip one up. But I never missed a single week in terms of bringing an essay. And then as we got closer to the end of the year and I had a lot more sort of one-on-one check-ins with my teacher, I need to bring essays for him to write and review. So having that sort of accountability system there, make sure that you don't sort of default to procrastination.
It's interesting because particularly with something like English, it's easy to get a little bit confused around what to actually do to improve. Like a lot of students feel like English, I don't really know how to improve. But often if you just ask a simple question, like if I had to get a good score in English, what would I do? Like what you did, you'd probably write a piece every week. You'd get feedback. You would probably read through the feedback really carefully, make sure you take away things so that the next essay is better. And if you do that every single week of the year, even if you improve incredibly slowly, you're going to get a good score because most people are not really willing to do that.
Definitely.
Overall, I guess in terms of ATAR, in terms of doing things that most people aren't willing to do to give yourself an advantage, what do you think were the biggest things you did that just gave you an edge overall in ATAR?
Yeah, definitely. So I think preparing early was a big start. A lot of people when it comes to school holidays and sort of the slower weeks of the year, so the start of the terms, for example, when people are still sort of getting into their groove, if you can, step on the gas and really provide that intensity from the start, you'll set yourself up for later. Second thing is probably what I mentioned before about getting exams done and under your belt from the very start of the year. Because one, it's what we spoke about in terms of you can find out how you're going, but secondly, you can find out what the examiners are actually looking for, and you can start pre-framing that in your brain for a whole entire year before you get to the exam. I think lastly as well, when it comes to the ATAR, find a good group of students who sort of have similar goals as you when it comes to preparing. Fortunately, going to the school that I went to, I had a lot of students and a lot of friends who are also preparing for medicine. And obviously it's nice, to have some sort of outlet to complain to when the UCAT's getting really stressful and whatnot. But you're also sort of celebrating each other's successes as well. And if you're doing the journey with other people, it's much more rewarding and doesn't really feel like work.
Yeah, I agree. I always feel like the subjects I did best in as well, it was when I had people who I was good friends with and we studied together in like an actually effective way. Because obviously there's different ways of studying with friends. There's going to the library and just chatting about random stuff the whole time. So there's actually like chatting about the topic and kind of teaching each other. I know you mentioned it before about the power of teaching in terms of boosting how much you learn. How much of that did you do when you were in year 11 and year 12?
So I sort of try to intertwine that quite often, and it wouldn't really be sort of formal teaching. It's more sort of, we're in class, my friend's having a bit of an issue with this particular maths topic, let me have a go and try explaining it to him. And you'll find that as you explain and refine someone else's knowledge and strength on the topic, in turn, your own comprehension of the topipic increases as well.
So I do think, having done a lot of teaching since I finished year 12, to be able to teach something, you do have to understand it better than even to do well in the test. Like you have to be able to think, okay, this is how it works. This is the ways people might go wrong. This is the way I often go wrong. This is kind of the best way of presenting it. So it definitely does make a big impact, I personally found. One other thing which I wanted to go back to was around like sitting mock exams early in the year. Because I know when I was in year 12, that was something I did in like the first term holidays. And I know a lot of students said like, oh, don't look at the exams, like leave them till the end of the year. You're going to waste them if you see the questions too early. And like personally for me, it made a big difference. Like ultimately you want to see the questions that are on the exam as early as possible. If you've already seen them earlier in the year, it's then later in the year when you see them again, well, and they're going to be easier obviously. But like, what did you think about that? Because I know a lot of people are a little bit unsure about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't control the fact that when it comes time to the end of the year, you will sit an exam. And then in turn, it makes sense to realize what sort of questions they ask and how they ask it earlier in advance. Because if you only realize that later, you might get to a stage where you realize that these last 6 months, you haven't actually been addressing the way that they ask questions and you've been doing something completely differently. So if you can sort of drop exams in, every single week up until the exam, like we mentioned before, you sort of frame the way that you think about questions, and you can have a lot more focused study on areas that actually matter. And being a year 12, as time poor as you are, like you need those sort of things.
I think it definitely applies to both the UCAT and and just all year 12 subjects really, because the reality is probably for ATAR, all ATAR subjects and the UCAT as well, it's not like the exam questions are completely random from year to year. Like of course there is some surprises, but if you look at the last like 5 years exams, you're going to have a pretty good idea of the style of the questions, the way they want you to answer generally. And if you know that, it's going to make it like a lot easier. So we've covered ATAR, UCAT, and then to jump onto interviews. How did you go about preparing for the interviews? Because obviously it's like a stressful stage of the process. By the time you get to the interviews, you've already gone through, got a good ATAR score, got a good UCAT score, and this is like the final thing that could hold you back from medicine. How did you kind of go about preparing for it?
I mean, you're definitely right. It is quite a high pressure situation. You've done the two hardest things, and this is the last one, so don't blow it. The way I sort of approached interviews, and to give you a little bit of context, I wasn't that great when it came to interviews. I barely ever did any outside of like some school leadership positions. But my sort of 3-step framework when it came to approaching the interviews was number one, gathering information, and then applying, and then iterating. And to sort of walk you through that process. In terms of gathering information, it turns out, just like with studying, interviews are also a universal concept that people do. So there's plenty of kind of content out there and resources, not only just specific to sort of medicine entry, but just interviews in general and how to really speak in an interview. So gathered a bunch of information there, looked at some of the universities I was actually applying to and seeing what their kind of program's about, learning more about medicine as well, and sort of the health system and sort of the challenges that people are grappling with. And once I've consolidated all that knowledge, I aggregate it into this next stage, which is applying it into practice interview questions.
Yeah.
And the way that I do is really just look at a question and then just record myself and just say whatever comes at the top of my head. And then that third step of iterating, I take that recording and really just break it down and try to find where my deficits are. And you can take it a step further and just show, your family, your friends, other students, and think, is it clear what I'm actually saying here? Like, did I actually address the question, or was there a particular area that wasn't clear?
I think recording and analyzing is definitely a very good way of doing it, because when you do look at yourself on camera, it's very easy to see where you could improve, even just like giving yourself feedback. How did you actually find the questions on the day? Like, were they easier than you expected or harder, or how did you feel you went with it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of my preparation, I prepared to like a variety of different question types and question difficulties. I'd say when it comes to the real one, I'd say it's pretty reasonable in terms of the questions that they ask, and you sort of think of it more as a conversation with the interviewer. So the difficulty wasn't too much of a factor that played. I guess more as sort of about the nerves heading into the interview, since you really realize how sort of high pressure it is. Yeah,
I guess that's probably a good last question to sort of end on as we get towards the end of the chat, which is just like overall year 12, it's like very stressful. Most people find it hard. The stress before the exams, the stress in the lead up to the exams, like interviews, extra pressure on top of that. How did you just manage your state throughout year 12 so you could handle it well?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you have the big picture goals. You have the big picture goals of getting into medicine, doing well in year 12, and you can break that down into sort of medium goals as well of the UCAT, of the ATAR, of the interview, and then you can break that down further into all the different subjects that you're doing and the different sections of the exam and the different types of interview questions that you do. But you need to sort of break down this tree enough to the point that the sort of derivatives that you land on are ones that are very digestible. Because if you wake up every single day and think to yourself, I need to get into medicine, I need to score a 99 ATAR, what you'll find is that the sort of overwhelming nature of that will manifest in some form of academic paralysis where you won't even start studying at all. So I think the thing that really helped me was just taking it a day at a time. I know what the big goal is, I know what the big picture is, I know what all the medium goals are, but my job today is to just tick off those small goals that are very achievable to do, and then just move on to the next day.
I think it's definitely a good way of thinking about it, because it's kind of like just focusing on the inputs and the outputs will naturally come, which is kind of what we found with all our programs. When I was kind of digging through like the students who did get into medicine or did do really well on different assessments, what did they do differently to everyone else? And I thought it was going to be they did some sort of crazy thing that no one else did. But if you literally just looked at what do they do on a daily basis and a weekly basis, and you didn't even know how they went, you would almost always predict if they got in. Like the people who were doing the right things on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, it always like translated to the end result. Which is, it's interesting that it does stem back to that in terms of like maximizing your results, but also it's a lot more manageable when you're not looking at that long-term goal all the time.
It seems so obvious, but I guess when you're in the thick of it, it's like you're very blind to it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So I guess overall we've covered ATAR, UCAT and interviews. If you had any general advice for someone who's applying for medicine and looking to get into it, just sort of one final ending word, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, everyone's little journey is different, right? Like even mine and the advice that I gave them, I'm only probably 5, 6, 7 years older than people watching this video. I've lived like this much more of life than them. So realistically, like what do I hold in the grand scheme of things? So I think with most people, your priority should really just be sort of figuring out yourself on this journey of whether that be studying medicine, whether that be just achieving your best in school in general. And when you can sort of think of it as a journey, just take it day by day, you're not going to be falling into these little traps that are set laid out in front of you. It's really just take it day by day, figure it out for yourself, and realize that your path is not going to look the same as the person next to you. Yeah, that's definitely good ending advice. And thanks for joining us for this chat today. It was good to hear about ATAR, UCAT interview, and all your advice generally. For future, we'll be releasing more interviews like this with other students who are studying medicine and also people who've just done well in year 12. So feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, thanks for joining us today, Melvin. Thanks, Charlie.